The ASEAN Summit that closed in Cebu carried the unmistakable weight of a world in motion. What had been planned as a showcase of Filipino hospitality, culture, and regional progress instead unfolded as a forum gripped by urgency, a gathering where leaders spent less time on ceremonial celebration and far more on answering a short, sharp set of questions about stability, supplies, and solidarity. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., chairing the meeting on behalf of the Philippines, made that shift plain. In his closing remarks, he told fellow leaders and international delegates, this was not the summit that we originally envisioned. In those 6 words, he captured the simple friction between an agenda set in calmer times and the abrupt reality of competing crises that arrived on the world stage. Those crises have a common thread. They are global, interconnected, and quick to travel maritime routes and market channels that bind Southeast Asia to the rest of the world. A deepening energy untraced in part to conflict in the Middle East and disruptions to key oil supply routes became a central concern. For many ASEAN economies, heavy reliance on imported energy makes them particularly exposed to the kind of prolonged price shocks and supply interruptions now threatening to ripple through households and factories alike. As leaders spoke in Cebu, the question was not only how to respond to immediate shortages, but how to build systems that blunt the impact of future shocks. Out of those conversations came a renewed push for practical mechanisms, not least an accelerated effort to ratify an ASEAN petroleum security framework designed to facilitate shared fuel supplies in emergencies. Officials acknowledged that while the idea has been on the table, many of its operational mechanisms remain unfinished. The message from the summit was direct. Regional plans need to move faster from concept to clicking gears because the next disruption may not wait for bureaucratic time. Tables, President Marcos framed that imperative as a test of leadership in real time. He said, leadership is tested not only by the plans that we make, but by how we respond when those plans must change. That line resonated across the summit halls. It implied a practical yardstick for governance, not how leaders show themselves in the comfort of carefully staged agendas, but how quickly and effectively they adapt when circumstances refuse to cooperate. Adaptation, the summit made clear, begins with unity. The Philippine president praised ASEAN's response to the moment with words that underline temperament as well as strategy, commending steadiness, pragmatism, and unity of purpose. Those 3 qualities became the summit's leitmotif, an argument that in a region of diverse histories and competing national priorities, cohesion itself is a form of resilience, yet cohesion is demanding when national interests and international pressures tug in different directions. The summit's negotiations were reportedly difficult and at times emotionally charged. Myanmar's continuing civil conflict, simmering territorial tensions in the South China Sea, and the acute worry about energy security each pressed on ASEAN's capacity to produce consensus. On these matters, the atmosphere in Cebu alternated between blunt realism and a deliberate effort to preserve the forum's core function as a place where disagreements are managed rather than allowed to dissolve into confrontation. Maritime security was a prominent subject. The Philippines used its chairmanship to float the idea of an ASEAN Maritime Center, not as a vehicle to confront any single external actor, but as a mechanism to coordinate regional responses to disputes and to uphold freedom of navigation in one of the world's busiest trade corridors. That conversation reflected a broader unease among ASEAN members about the steady creep of tension in the South China Sea. Several claimant states, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, maintain overlapping territorial claims with China, and those competing assertions have repeatedly tested the limits of regional diplomacy. The Maritime Center proposal stops short of hardline measures, but it underscores an emerging preference for collective capacity and information sharing over unilateral escalation. Cross-border tension between neighbors also demanded immediate attention. Leaders turned to recent clashes along the Thailand-Cambodia border with an eye toward de-escalation. President Marcos hosted trilateral talks aimed at reinforcing a fragile ceasefire and nudging both governments toward a more durable normalization. Those conversations were a reminder that ASEAN's crisis management is often as much about patching wounds between neighbors as it is about hedging against distant shocks delivered by global currents. Myanmar, meanwhile, remained a raw and sensitive subject. Delegates engaged in intense discussions about how to confront a political reality shaped by military control, humanitarian suffering, and limited access for aid. Progress in Cebu on Myanmar was, by most accounts, limited. ASEAN's traditional playbook, an emphasis on engagement, consensus, and non-interference, continues to collide with the moral and practical demands of a prolonged internal conflict. The result is a slow-moving diplomacy that struggles to offer immediate relief to civilians while attempting to preserve channels for eventual political settlement. Throughout the summit, President Marcos returned to a theme that blended principle with purpose. ASEAN's value lies in making sure member states do not shoulder crises alone. He said no member state can insulate itself entirely from instability beyond its borders. He also warned against isolation in response to that vulnerability, saying neither should any member state feel that it must face these challenges alone. Those statements were more than platitude. They were an appeal to the compact that underpins ASEAN, that mutual exposure to risk must be matched by mutual commitment to respond. Beyond security and supply issues, leaders in Cebu discussed the practicalities of economic resilience. Rising fuel costs and inflationary pressure have immediate consequences for households and business, and ASEAN discussions emphasize the need to protect citizens from shocks that hit first and hardest at the lower end of the economic ladder. The summit's agenda, framed by the Philippine chairmanship under the theme Navigating Our Future Together, emphasized people-centered development, innovation, and resilience as the pathways through which the bloc hopes to translate diplomatic arrangements into real-world protections for ordinary families. That is why several interventions were practical and operational in tone. Delegations pushed for faster ratification of the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement and for clearer plans to operationalize emergency sharing of fuel supply. They also stressed improvements to supply chain coordination and food security measures, recognizing that energy instability quickly reverberates through logistics networks and agricultural inputs. The aim is to make the region less brittle, to build redundancy, faster information flows, and contingency planning into systems that global volatility has shown to be vulnerable. Despite the intensity of debate, Marcos struck an ultimately optimistic note as he brought the summit to a close. He thanked leaders for their cooperation and for supporting the Philippines throughout a challenging chairmanship. Your presence here has given real meaning to the chairmanship, he said, a line that acknowledged both the burdens and the solidarity of hosting in a fraught year. He added, our region remains strongest when it moves forward together, and urged leaders to take home a renewed sense of shared purpose. That shared purpose was given texture by a reminder of ASEAN's history. The summit coincided with symbolic milestones. 2026 marks the 50th anniversary of a foundational regional agreement that underlines peaceful coexistence and dialogue. That anniversary offered a historical hinge, a reason to recall how the organization's endurance over decades has relied more on pragmatic cooperation during crises than on the illusion of permanency in stable times. As Marcos put it, the strength of ASEAN has never depended on the absence of difficulty. Rather, longevity has been forged through repeated instances of facing problems together. Cebu's meetings did not happen in a vacuum. Outside ASEAN's walls, the international environment has been roiled by a series of flashpoints, conflicts, strategic standoffs, and shifting alliances that together make regional calculations more complex. Delegates and commentators alike referenced a wider set of tensions, including those involving the United States, Iran, and Israel, and the way those tensions reshape global energy markets, diplomatic alignments, and security postures. The conversation in Cebu acknowledged an uncomfortable reality. ASEAN's choices are increasingly framed not only by regional actors, but by a global balance of power in flux. For the Philippines, the summit carried a dual domestic and diplomatic significance. President Marcos, who has led the country since 2022 is managing pressures at home, rising fuel prices, economic anxieties, and political debates, even as he sought to steer a consensus among neighbors about how to respond to external shocks. The chairmanship thrust his country into the spotlight at a moment when the success of Small Steps, a maritime coordination center, faster ratification of fuel sharing agreements, a stronger response to cross-border tensions could produce outsized returns in stability and goodwill. Cebu's summit also highlighted the delicate balance ASEAN must maintain in relations with major powers. Member states are increasingly navigating between deeper secure. It's vied with countries such as the United States and pragmatic economic engagements with others, notably China. That balancing act was reflected in the summit's diplomacy. Proposals like the Maritime Center and the soft insistence on collective measures are intended to preserve regional autonomy without provoking direct confrontation. The outcome in Cebu was not a dramatic treaty or a sweeping new mechanism. It was a reaffirmation, sometimes messy, sometimes halting, of a commitment to act together. Leaders left with an agenda that is more operational than inspirational: accelerate ratifications, finish operational details on existing frameworks, beef up maritime cooperation, and renew efforts to mediate local disputes before they flare. These are incremental steps, but in an era of cascading crises, incrementalism can be a lifeline. As the summit concluded, President Marcos returned to gratitude and to a forward-facing message. He expressed hope that future ASEAN meetings in the Philippines would be held under more positive circumstances. Said, "We look forward to welcoming you again to the Philippines in our future meetings." Then, offering a broader summation of the week's purpose and hope, he said, ASEAN can continue to shape a region that is resilient, innovative, dynamic, and people-centered. And finally, crystallizing the summit's central theme, he said, "As we lead, sail, rise, ASEAN, we stand even more confident and determined to navigate our future together." Those closing lines were an appeal to continuity, to the idea that in the face of setbacks and unforeseen shocks, institutions and relationships that are habitually renewed can become the scaffolding for stability. For a region that depends on open seas, uninterrupted trade, and predictable markets, the calculus is straightforward. Shared vulnerability demands shared action. What came out of Cebu then was less a triumphalist vision than a pragmatic roadmap: work faster on frameworks for MEM. Mutual assistance, invest in maritime cooperation and information sharing, seek diplomatic solutions to immediate border flare-ups, and hold the line on humanitarian engagement even when political settlements remain distant. For citizens across Southeast Asia, the measure of success will be simple and immediate: fewer blackouts, steadier fuel supplies, calmer border towns, and more reliable access to food and essential goods. The narrative that emerged from the summit is one of a region aware of its limits and determined to use its collective capacities to expand them. ASEAN's act has been practical rather than theatrical, a set of decisions and initiatives aimed at making collective life less vulnerable to the kind of outside shocks that turned a planned celebration into an emergency council. The hope is that those decisions, once turned into action, will speak more loudly than words. At a moment of worldwide upheaval, the Cebu meeting served as a reminder that regional institutions can still be relevant if they are pragmatic, if they prioritize people, and if they are willing to move at the pace the crisis demands. The test now moves from words into implementation. For the leaders who left Cebu, the work will be measured in the months ahead by whether they can turn frameworks into safeguards and solidarity into tangible protection for ordinary lives. In the end, the summit's most persistent theme was also its simplest: no country here can navigate alone. That reality, uncomfortable for states that prize sovereignty as much as ASEAN members do, is also the source of the bloc's potential strength. When crises arrive, the ability to respond together may be the region's best insurance policy. As the leaders disperse from Cebu, they carry with them the awareness that the next test is imminent and that the success of this summit will be judged not by speeches but by the speed and effectiveness of the responses that follow.